What if I told you that the same stage that launched one of Christian music's brightest stars also became the place where his entire world came crashing down in just 72 hours? And what if that same prestigious platform later welcomed a man who had never sung professionally in his life? Someone who spent more time in weight rooms than recording studios? These aren't hypothetical questions. They're the real stories of Michael English and Todd Suttles, two men whose journeys through the Gaither Vocal Band couldn't be more different, yet both walked away from one of gospel music's most coveted positions. By the time we're done here, you'll understand why talent alone isn't enough to survive in Christian music, and why sometimes the most authentic voices are the ones that get pushed out. Michael English wasn't just another gospel singer trying to make it big. Born in 1,962 inches, Kenansville, North Carolina, he grew up breathing Southern gospel music. His family group, the Singing Samaritans, traveled the church circuit, and from an early age, Michael's voice stood out in ways that made professionals stop and listen. This wasn't just talent. It was the kind of gift that comes along maybe once in a generation. By his teens, groups like the Singing Americans and the Goodmans were already fighting over him. Then, in 1985, Bill Gaither made the call that would change everything. Michael joined the Gaither Vocal Band, and suddenly Southern gospel had a new sound. His tenor could make you cry without warning, and songs like "Mary, Did You Know?" and "I Bowed on My Knees and Cried Holy" became instant classics because of how Michael delivered them. He didn't just sing words, he made you feel every syllable in your chest. For fans, Michael English became the voice of an era. He was the complete package. The looks, the voice, the spiritual depth that made every performance feel like a genuine encounter with something bigger than entertainment. By the early 90s, Michael was ready for his solo career. Bill Gaither supported the move, and Michael's debut album proved everyone right about his potential. He wasn't just good for gospel music. He was good enough to cross over into mainstream contemporary Christian music. Then came 1994, the year that should have cemented Michael's legacy as one of the greats. At the Dove Awards, he walked away with 4 trophies, including Artist of the Year. That night, standing on stage with those awards in his hands, Michael English represented everything Christian music aspired to be. Radio couldn't play his songs enough. Churches wanted him for their special events. Young singers studied his technique. The industry was already predicting he'd be the next Amy Grant, someone who could bring gospel music to audiences that had never set foot in a Southern church. But here's the thing about reaching the top. The fall from that height is absolutely devastating. Just days after his Dove Award triumph, Michael made a confession that sent shockwaves through the entire Christian music world. He'd had an extramarital affair with Maribeth Jordan, a singer from the group First Call. The timing couldn't have been worse. This wasn't some old mistake finally coming to light. This was happening right now, at the peak of his career, while he was being celebrated as the face of Christian music excellence. The response was swift and brutal. His record label dropped him immediately. Radio stations pulled every song. Churches canceled appearances and released statements distancing themselves from him. Some of his fellow artists publicly condemned him. Michael's reaction tells you everything about where his head was in that moment. He voluntarily returned all 4 Dove Awards, including Artist of the Year. Instead, he gave them back because the shame was too crushing to hold on to anything that reminded him of what he'd just destroyed. The fallout went beyond his career. His marriage ended. Depression hit him like a freight train. He turned to substances to numb the pain of watching everything he'd built disappear overnight. For years, Michael English essentially vanished from public life. And here's where the story gets really interesting, because it exposes something uncomfortable about how Christian communities handle fallen leaders. Think about the songs Michael had been singing his entire career. Amazing Grace, The Prodigal Son, stories about broken people finding redemption, messages about God's mercy for those who mess up. Yet when Michael became the living embodiment of those themes, when he needed that grace more than he'd ever needed anything, Large parts of the Christian music world responded not with compassion, but with total rejection. Radio stations didn't say, "Here's someone who can teach us about redemption." They treated his music like it was contaminated. Churches didn't offer to walk alongside him through restoration. They worried about what his presence would do to their reputation. This contradiction, singing about grace while practicing condemnation, reveals a toxic pattern in religious celebrity culture that goes way beyond Michael's individual story. But Michael's story doesn't end in that dark place. Bill Gaither, who could have easily walked away and protected his own reputation, quietly stayed in contact. He offered support without making it public. He reminded Michael that his failures hadn't erased his worth as a person or his gifts as a singer. This wasn't about excusing what happened. It was about doing the hard, unglamorous work of actual restoration. Slowly, with help from counselors, friends, and Bill's steady presence, Michael started rebuilding. He got sober. He confronted the issues that had led to his choices. He took real responsibility instead of making excuses. And gradually, he started singing again. When Michael rejoined the Gaither Vocal Band in 2009, it meant something profound. For some people, it was proof that grace isn't just a concept you sing about. It's something that actually happens in real life. For others, it raised questions about whether enough time had passed, whether true repentance had occurred. But anyone who heard Michael sing during this second chapter noticed something different. The technical ability was still there, maybe even better than before, but now there was a depth that couldn't have existed without the fall. When he sang about grace, you knew he wasn't performing, he was testifying to something he'd lived through in the darkest possible way. In 2013, Michael left the Gaither Vocal Band again, and this time the reasons were more complicated. The official statement talked about his solo career, scheduling issues, health concerns, all true, but insiders suggested there was more to it. The emotional weight of performing while carrying his past remained crushing. Chronic anxiety made every show feel like being judged all over again. The practical challenges of balancing solo work with the band's touring schedule created constant stress. Some people wondered if there were tensions about his role in the group, questions about whether he'd ever fully escape the shadow of his scandal. This second exit wasn't about moral failure, it was about exhaustion. Sometimes the weight of redemption in public feels almost as heavy as the weight of public shame. Now let's talk about someone whose path to the Gaither Vocal Band was so different it almost sounds made up. Todd Suttles didn't come from gospel music royalty. He wasn't discovered as a teenage prodigy. He didn't spend decades climbing the Southern gospel ladder. Todd came from college athletics. He was the strength and conditioning coach at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, respected for his ability to build toughness in athletes and lead teams through intense preparation. His world was weight rooms and practice fields, not recording studios and church stages. But Todd had something you can't teach, a rich baritone voice and an infectious joy that drew people to him naturally. He wasn't performing spirituality, he was living it, and everyone around him could tell the difference. Through a series of connections, Todd met Bill Gaither, and Bill immediately recognized something he'd spent a lifetime learning to spot: authenticity. Todd wasn't trying to be anything except exactly who he was. A former athlete who loved Jesus, loved people, and had discovered his voice could connect with audiences in powerful ways. Despite having zero formal training, despite lacking the professional credentials that typically defined Gaither Vocal Band members, Bill saw exactly what the group needed. When Todd joined in early 2014, he brought something fresh that energized the entire ensemble. His baritone gave the harmonies a new foundation. His stage presence felt genuine without being calculated. His testimony resonated with people who'd never connect with a traditional gospel background. Here was someone who understood regular Americans, who could talk about faith in language that made sense to people working everyday jobs, facing everyday struggles. Fans loved Todd not just for his voice, but for his heart. The way he smiled through performances like he couldn't believe this was his life, the way every lyric felt like personal conversation instead of professional obligation. For several years, Todd toured extensively with the band, recording albums and appearing in videos that captured his energy and authenticity. He represented a new direction for the group, one that emphasized joy, realness over polish, and diversity of backgrounds that made gospel music feel accessible to outsiders. But here's where Todd's story takes a strange turn. Unlike Michael's very public fall and restoration, Todd's situation has unfolded mostly in whispers and speculation. There's been no formal announcement about him leaving permanently. He still appears occasionally in promotional materials and live shows, but anyone paying attention has noticed his presence has significantly decreased over recent years, and that reduction has sparked all kinds of theories about what's really happening behind the scenes. According to people close to the organization, there may have been growing tensions around creative direction. Todd, coming from an independent background where he'd had significant autonomy as a coach, reportedly struggled with the hierarchical structure and rigid scheduling of such an established organization. Touring with the Gaither Vocal Band isn't casual weekend gigs. It's a complex operation with demanding schedules, contracts, and very little flexibility. Some insiders hint at philosophical disagreements that went deeper than scheduling conflicts, touching on sensitive issues like race in Christian music, compensation disparities between members, and different visions for what gospel music should prioritize in today's cultural landscape. Most tellingly, Todd's public appearances with the group have become sparse, and his social media, which he'd previously used enthusiastically to promote Gaither events, has gone almost silent about the band. This conspicuous absence has fueled speculation. Some think he's quietly pursuing new ministry opportunities that better fit his gifts. Others believe he's reassessing priorities and recognizing the demands don't align with his values around family and balance. Still others, particularly those with inside connections, suggest more significant conflicts that have never been made public. There's also been talk about potential tensions between Michael and Todd themselves, though we're venturing into speculation territory here. People close to the band have suggested their personalities and approaches might not have meshed smoothly. Michael was the consummate professional with decades of experience, someone who understood technical demands and brought intense emotional energy that required excellence from everyone. His background was steeped in Southern gospel traditions, where vocal precision and professional presentation were non-negotiable. Todd came from a completely different world, where authenticity mattered more than technical perfection, where the energy of the moment could override careful planning, where a team-first coaching mentality shaped how he approached partnerships. According to some accounts, these different approaches occasionally created friction during rehearsals and tours, particularly around artistic authority and stage dynamics. Others downplay any serious conflict, suggesting what looked like tension was just natural adjustment when very different personalities work toward the same goal through different methods. What's certain is that both men represent crucial aspects of what gospel music needs to be. The Gaither Vocal Band, like any long-standing organization, constantly navigates between maintaining traditions that made them successful and adapting to changing expectations and new voices. Michael represented the traditional approach at its absolute best, a voice so exceptional it justified the entire Southern gospel enterprise. Todd represented something newer and harder to define, a reminder that God's calling doesn't follow professional pathways, that authenticity can rival technical excellence in moving hearts, and that gospel music needs voices from outside its traditional circles to stay relevant. Any friction between these approaches wasn't really about personality conflicts, but about larger institutional questions every artistic organization faces. Looking at these intertwined stories reveals profound lessons that extend beyond these two men, or even beyond gospel music. Michael's fall and the industry's response show how Christian communities create impossible standards for public figures, celebrating their gifts while demanding moral perfection no human can sustain. The tragedy isn't that Michael failed, because everyone fails, but that the Christian celebrity infrastructure created an environment where his failure triggered immediate, total rejection, rather than being absorbed within a framework of grace. The people singing about redemption proved remarkably reluctant to extend it, exposing deep sickness in how religious communities handle the humanity of their leaders. Michael's story is ultimately hopeful because restoration did happen, but we shouldn't forget the unnecessary years of suffering caused by a system that preached grace but practiced condemnation. Todd's story teaches us about what gets valued and marginalized in professional ministry. He brought extraordinary gifts that couldn't be measured in technical ability or credentials, and his presence expanded the group's reach significantly. Yet rumors of his struggles suggest institutions built on traditional models don't always know how to honor voices from outside those models, even when those voices bring genuine value. If Todd experienced marginalization or conflict, it wasn't from lack of talent, but because systems designed around one approach struggled to accommodate different backgrounds and perspectives. This speaks to a larger challenge facing Christian institutions: creating space for diverse voices without losing identity or mission. Third, and perhaps most importantly, these stories remind us that the people who create the music we love, the voices that lead us in worship and inspire us in our faith journeys, are fundamentally human, carrying their own wounds, fighting their own battles, and navigating their own complicated relationships with calling and career. Michael English's soaring tenor and emotional depth came not just from natural talent, but from a life that included profound pain, devastating failure, and hard-won redemption. His ability to sing about grace with such conviction isn't despite his fall, but in many ways because of it. Because he knows from personal experience what it means to be graciously lifted from a pit of despair. Todd Suttles' infectious joy and authentic presence on stage weren't manufactured for performance. They emerged from a life lived outside the gospel music bubble, from experiences in weight rooms and coaching meetings where he learned that genuine connection matters more than polished presentation. Both men brought their whole selves to their ministry, with all the complications that entails. And while that created challenges and conflicts, it also created moments of genuine spiritual power that touched countless lives. As the Gaither Vocal Band continues its journey into the future, it will undoubtedly welcome new members with new styles and new perspectives, because that's what any living institution must do to survive across generations. But in that forward movement, we must never forget the cost paid by those who cleared the path before, the ones who brought their gifts and their brokenness, their excellence and their humanity, their triumphs and their struggles to the stage, and left everything they had in service of the gospel message. Michael English brought truth, raw emotion, and a voice that could make heaven feel close, but he also brought the painful testimony that even the most gifted can fall, and that restoration, while possible, comes at tremendous personal cost and requires communities willing to embrace the messy work of grace. Todd Suttles brought energy, resilience, and a joyful disruption of conventions that reminded everyone that God's calling isn't limited to those with traditional credentials, but his story also reminds us that bringing new voices into established institutions requires more than just acknowledging their gifts. It requires structural willingness to adapt and make genuine space for different approaches and perspectives. The enduring legacy of both men points to the central truth that gospel music, at its best, has never been about perfection, but about authenticity in the face of our imperfections, not about avoiding failure, but about finding hope in the aftermath of failure, not about maintaining spotless reputations, but about testifying to a God who specializes in redeeming broken things and using wounded healers to speak truth into other people's pain. In an era when Christian music increasingly feels commercialized, when image sometimes overshadows message, when the temptation towards celebrity culture threatens to eclipse the servant-hearted mission at the core of ministry, the stories of Michael English and Todd Suttles call us back to something more fundamental and more challenging. They remind us that the kingdom of God has always been populated by the unlikely, the fallen, the ones who took unconventional paths, The ones who failed spectacularly and then rose again, the ones whose gifts came wrapped in humanity rather than sanitized perfection. Fans will continue to wonder about the details that remain hidden, about whether Todd really is stepping away permanently, and why, about whether Michael could have found a lasting place with the group if circumstances had been different, about what tensions or disagreements might have existed behind the polished performances and carefully crafted public statements. Some of those answers may emerge over time, as people become willing to speak more candidly about their experiences, while others will likely remain forever in the realm of confidential conversations and private decisions that are nobody's business but those directly involved. But regardless of what we eventually learn or don't learn, the voices of these two men will continue echoing in the hearts of everyone who heard them, not because they were perfect, but precisely because they weren't. Because every note they sang and every testimony they shared carried the unmistakable authenticity of real humans wrestling with real callings in a real world that doesn't always cooperate with our plans or expectations. And perhaps that's the most powerful legacy any artist can leave behind. Not a catalog of perfect performances or an unblemished reputation or a career trajectory that follows all the expected patterns, but a testimony that even in our brokenness, even in our failures, even in our struggles with institutions and systems, and each other, even when we can't seem to find our place or maintain our footing, God still uses us,